I just want to welcome everybody to panel number 3 about local government partnerships in education. We'll have 3 presentations today and encourage everybody to put your questions into the Q&A box, and I will get to them after all 3 presentations. I am Brian Backstrom. I'm the Director of Education Policy Studies for the Rockefeller Institute of Government here at SUNY, and I'll be moderating today's event. Let's get right to it. Our first panelist is Rebecca Natow. She's Assistant Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy at Hofstra University, and she's a fellow here at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. Rebecca?
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to share my screen. Just give me a moment. Okay, everybody can see that, right? Okay. Thanks so much for being here, everyone. As Brian said, I'm an Assistant Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy at Hofstra University and a fellow at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. And my presentation today is entitled, How Local Governments Influence Higher Education. So although higher education policy is generally perceived as a matter for federal and state governments, local governments often play an important role in higher education. From funding and governing community colleges to implementing cooperative extension programs with land-grant universities, local governments influence higher education institutions and students in ways that broaden access to college and provide important services for communities. In this analysis that I'm presenting today, I'll be advancing a typology of the ways local governments influence higher education. The components of the typology are as follows. First, funding. Second, regulation, then community programs, next, advocacy, then intergovernmental partnerships, and of course, there are combinations of these components as well. Advancing this typology can bring greater transparency to the relationships between local governments and higher education. Just a brief word about the research methods. Much of the material that went into this analysis was gathered as part of a larger project examining the role of the federal government in higher education. And a final product of that larger study was my new book entitled Reexamining the Federal Role in Higher Education, Politics and Policy Making in the Post-Secondary Sector, which was published earlier this year by Teachers College Press. The book was based on research that involved a careful review of numerous policy relevant documents and reports, a review of academic literature, and interviews with dozens of policy actors. The book contains some discussion of the ways that local governments have been involved in higher education, particularly in partnership with federal and state governments. To construct this typology, which is the subject of this presentation, I also examined some additional policy relevant documents, which included documents from local government websites, research literature, news articles, and the websites of some higher education institutions, as well as they were responding to local government policies. These documentary data were reviewed to identify relationships, partnerships, coordination, funding, and regulation with regard to local governments and higher education institutions. So getting to the typology, the first category is funding. Funding is an important way that local governments influence higher education. Often this funding takes the form of appropriations to community colleges, because community colleges receive appropriations from both state and local governments. Nationally, local governments provide about $12 billion annually in appropriations for community colleges. Beyond appropriations, local government funding has also found its way to higher education through grants and contracts. One form of grant aid takes the form of local government scholarships, whether need-based or non-need-based, to students, so a form of student financial aid. Local governments may also provide funding to higher education institutions through government contracts with those institutions. The next category is regulation. Local governments also play a role in regulating higher education. As with funding, local government regulations are particularly prevalent for community colleges because local officials are often involved in appointing members of community college governing boards. So for example, here in New York State, community colleges are part of either the the CUNY system, City University of New York, or the State University of New York, SUNY. In the SUNY system, each community college has what's called a local municipal sponsor, such as a county government. And some members of the Board of Trustees for the community college are appointed by the local municipal sponsor, while others are appointed by the governor. Other types of local regulations apply to higher education as well, including zoning laws and ordinances that apply broadly within local borders. Sometimes it's not entirely clear whether a local rule applies to institutions of higher education, and this is due to the nature of local authority, which is itself a delegation of state power, and also due to the nature of public higher education institutions as arms of the state government. Even community colleges, which as explained previously have some local governance, they're also governed by the state and are often part of a state university system, as is the case with the SUNY system. I'll provide an example from the COVID-19 pandemic. Colleges and universities' digestion of local government rules and orders during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic illustrates the complexity of local government's regulation of higher education. So for example, in my home county on Long Island, Nassau County, the county executive had declared a state of emergency due to the COVID pandemic on March 23rd, 2020 in an executive order that also directed personnel of certain county government offices to work remotely. The same order, however, specifically excluded Nassau Community College from the declaration, stating that the college is, quote, subject to policy determinations by the Board of Trustees of the State University of New York. Also, following local stay-home orders by mayors and other local officials across the country, some colleges and universities worked to understand precisely how those orders would affect those institutions and their affiliates. For example, following a March 2020 stay-home order issued by the city of St. Louis University issued a statement saying, and I quote, "We continue to communicate with city officials to understand what that means for SLU, the students who continue to live on campus, and the faculty and staff members who need to use campus spaces and resources to provide remote learning." Also in March 2020, the city of San Antonio issued its own stay-home order. The University of Texas at San Antonio released a statement indicating the steps that the university had taken so far, which made it, quote, quite close to what is now required moving forward. And the university also indicated that the institution planned to take additional steps to comply with the stay-home order, but also noted that, quote, as a higher education institution, we will need to continue critical services and operations to support our on-campus residents and our important research mission, especially in regards to advancing research that serves the national interest during a pandemic. So the complexity of the university itself and the complexity of understanding how state and local policies were affecting higher education during a time of crisis did lead to some confusion, at least initially, as to what was required from the higher education institutions. The third category is community programs. Local governments have also been involved with higher education in various community programs. Sometimes local governments partner with higher education institutions to provide important services to community members. So again, during the global pandemic, many higher education institutions partnered with state and local governments to provide COVID testing and vaccine distribution to members of the community. Through their role in community college funding and governance, local governments indirectly provide a number of educational services within their communities. For example, community colleges often provide instruction or information, generally not for credit, on a wide range of topics that may be of interest to community members. These include recreational subjects such as ceramics or yoga, but also skills courses such as computing and some vocational training. Some community colleges also sometimes provide youth recreational programs, such as weekend classes or summer camps for school-aged children. For example, in New York, Westchester County, the Westchester Community College offers various arts and technology programs for children from ages 7 through 17. Some community colleges offer adult basic education programs, which provide basic educational skills training, generally in literacy, math, and language arts, for adult students who do not hold a high school diploma. Some community colleges also partner with local school districts on dual enrollment programs for high school students. These programs allow high school students to enroll and earn credits in college courses. Research has shown that dual enrollment programs can be effective at reducing the need for developmental education once students reach college, and they also increase the likelihood of timely graduation from associate degree programs for students who participated in dual enrollment programs and then enrolled in community college afterwards. Because dual enrollment programs involve community colleges and public school districts, local governments have involvement on both sides of those agreements. The next category is advocacy. Local governments are involved in advocacy in the higher education space. Some of this occurs, again, via the community colleges, which have local government influence through funding and governance. And they're also often involved through organizations such as the American Association of Community Colleges and the Association of Community College Trustees that engage in various advocacy and lobbying activities, promoting policy change that would better serve community colleges and their stakeholders. These organizations' advocacy activities include participation in the U.S. Department of Education's rulemaking process, which happens to be going on right now, and it develops regulations that govern higher education federal student financial aid programs. Community colleges and their associations have also lobbied state and federal legislatures to promote policies that are beneficial to their institutions. And finally, the last category is intergovernmental partnerships. Local governments often act in partnership with their states and or the federal government to influence higher education. Community colleges, again, are an example of such an intergovernmental partnership. In New York State, we have community colleges, again, are part of the SUNY system. They're funded in part by local and state governments, and they have members of their governing boards appointed by both state and local officials. Another example of an intergovernmental partnership involving higher education are the cooperative extension services with land-grant universities. These programs, sponsored by the federal government's Department of Agriculture and funded in part by state and local governments as well as private resources, offer community education and activities based on agricultural research with regard to sustainability, food safety, childhood enrichment, and other subjects. Local governments play a major role in the implementation of cooperative extension programs, with local government facilities housing many of the services. And as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, there are many ways that there are combinations of those categories. They overlap and work in combination with each other. So for example, as just mentioned, cooperative extension services are partnerships between the federal, state, and local governments, as well as land-grant institutions and some private entities. But they also involve funding from local governments, including in-kind contributions, such as the use of space in local government buildings. These partnerships are also often providing community programs, as cooperative extension services provide useful educational and recreational activities for their communities. As mentioned above, community colleges are a form of intergovernmental partnership. Local governments have a say in the operations of community colleges, and community colleges are funded by different levels of government, including through local appropriations. Also, because funding for higher education institutions typically comes with certain requirements or standards set by the government entity providing the funding, funding relationships between local governments and higher education institutions generally also involve regulation. Finally, advocacy relationships between local governments and higher education often involve partnerships as well, since the entities doing the advocating are often community colleges or associations representing community colleges. Because community colleges are themselves a form of state and local partnership, advocacy activities involving these institutions necessarily involve intergovernmental partnership as well. To summarize, this analysis produced a typology of ways local governments influence higher education. The components of the typology were funding, regulation, community programs, advocacy, and intergovernmental partnerships. This analysis also demonstrated how these components can work in conjunction with each other, such as through cooperative extension programs, and through which local governments provide funding, implement community programs, and engage in federal, state, and local partnership. This typology brings greater transparency to relationships between local governments and higher education and advances the scholarly community's understanding of the important ways local governments have been involved with and influence higher education. There's currently a shortage of research on the relationship between higher education institutions and their local governments in the United States. As an agenda for future research, it might include the following: studies of local funding of higher education and how institutions make use of revenues received from local governments, analyses of the relationships between higher education institutions and local public officials, asking research questions such as the extent to which those relationships bring resources to the institutions, the responsiveness of local public officials to institutional needs and demands, the extent to which these relationships vary between public and private institutions, or based on geography, such as whether a college is located in an urban, rural, or suburban location. At the community college level, researchers may investigate the relative influence of state versus local government control over operations, funding choices, and other matters involving college governance. And finally, future research could examine how local governments and higher education institutions work together to address the COVID-19 crisis. To close, I would just like to reiterate that this typology demonstrates how local governments are involved with higher education in a number of important ways. And by investigating these and other matters, researchers can help shed light on how this influence functions, how local officials have supported colleges and universities, and how higher education institutions and local governments have worked together to benefit their communities. Thank you so much for listening, and I will be happy to answer your questions during the Q&A session.
Thank you, Rebecca. Very much appreciated. I think we always think of higher education institutions as creatures of the state and monitored by the federal government. And maybe with the exception of community colleges that have the natural local tie, but this was very enlightening about the various roles that local government and influences that local government has on those higher institutions. And again, just a reminder, if anyone has any Q&As, please put them into the box. If they're directed to a particular presenter this afternoon, just go ahead and identify that in the Q&A as well. All right, let's go on to Matthew Camp, who can tell us that even venerable institutions of higher education can get dirty in the political mud of lobbying. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. So happy to share my screen here. And here we go. My name is Matthew Camp. I'm Director of Government Relations at Teachers College at Columbia. And this is about an inside look at what goes on in lobbying in New York State. I think this was Professor Natow's second bullet in her recommended next steps. We didn't plan it that way, but I have been following in her footsteps for many years. So I'm very grateful about all of her work. So yeah, I've been a lobbyist for about 14 years at Columbia and another couple of years before that at Princeton University. I've been on the other side too, working for a couple of different US state senators. This work is chapter 4 of my dissertation, the quantitative component. Chapter 3 is a qualitative component. Chapter 3 is the more federal level data-driven component. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give a broad introduction why this topic is important. A quick look at the methods, which are, again, mostly interviews, share some findings and implications. So as we just heard, lobbying has this cachet, this branding around it that's not exactly great. I have to say I haven't been to any smoke-filled rooms sipping on whiskeys and smoking cigars. College lobbying is a little bit different, I think, because we're very limited. Most colleges are nonprofits and aren't able to give campaign contributions. I haven't handed any bags of cash to legislators ever. And so there's things we can't do, and that kind of necessity is the mother of invention. So what can we do? We leverage our expertise and mobilize different constituencies within higher ed. So that's one reason I wanted to look into this, to study what I do as a professional and kind of demystify it. The other reason is that there's very little data on how colleges lobby. I see a little bit on a federal level. The solid line here is what colleges have spent in the last bunch of years. In 2021, they spent about 90 million. On the right side of the scale is in millions. The dotted line is all industries in the billions, and they've spent about close to $4 billion last year. So colleges are just a little bit late to the game. but are fairly closely tracking all industry lobbying. And in fact, in my dissertation, I asked the question, do colleges lobby like corporations? Talk about that another time. Okay, so I also found that nationally, about 38% of colleges lobbied at any one time in the 11-year period ending in 2014. But besides that, we don't know much else about higher lobbying or lobbying in general. There's a lot of, we don't know much about the process. A lot of political science research looks at the product of lobbying. So what kind of bills do you get passed? How does the legislator vote, type of thing. I have to say, I haven't really done that in my years of lobbying. We track legislation, but I wouldn't be so bold to think that my efforts have actually influenced the legislator to make a final voting decision. I'm more interested in the steps that lead up to that, the relationships that we build. And then going into the local level, we know even less about state level. So I hope to kind of open up the hood here, look under to see what goes on in New York State. So I did interviews with 20 lobbyists and legislators in 2 waves, 2017, 2020, and they hailed from the SUNY CUNY privates, the for-profits, and then contract lobbyists who represent any number of those sectors, and also legislators and their staff who work on the higher ed committees. So here's a quick breakdown of who those folks are, their mean range of experience, gender, and you could see that they come evenly from all the 3 sectors. And so a quick look at some of the findings. I've asked the questions, why do colleges lobby, and then how do they lobby? So in terms of why, I grouped it into offense and defense. So offense is going for something, i.e. dollars. So in New York State, something that came up a lot was the tuition assistance program, TAP, higher education assistance program, HEOP, Excelsior, which is the governor's free college program for public colleges, Bundy Aid, which is for private colleges, a direct kind of block grant that colleges usually use for financial aid. And then defense, as Professor Natow alluded to, is accountability, regulations. And in this period of time, I heard a lot about sexual assault regulations, gainful employment, which is specifically geared towards for-profit colleges. And then the cost of colleges, which is probably applicable to most, especially the privates. So quick breakdown of what I heard, all the different rationales, budget related, that's again the offense, and non-budget is kind of the defensive. So student aid was the big one, and it was pretty evenly distributed, 34% across the 3 different sectors. I thought it was interesting, I highlighted a couple of quick things here in research. The privates mostly focused on research. And that's probably not a coincidence. We've got Cornell and NYU and Columbia, some of the big private research institutions. And then you can see gainful employment was solely the purview of the for-profits. Next up, a little bit closer look. I'm going to share a quote I heard from a lobbyist at a small private college in New York State who was responding to the governor's sexual assault regulations. I'll leave the irony of that for you to figure out on your own. And so they said the governor put out a program called Enough is Enough, which applies to all sectors and that required a fair amount of work done at the college level. Whatever the Monday was before the 4th of July and the day before the 4th, they mailed a letter saying they wanted a response by Friday from all these colleges on a series of questions, sort of an audit. So we got involved, going to them, the governor's office, and saying, this is like Trump putting up the wall. And this is crazy. You know, you mail something on a Monday and you want it on a Friday, there's a holiday in the middle of it. So part of our life is to make sure that their goal is accomplished, so they get what they want done. And I asked, so does that happen periodically? And this person says it happens more than you think. And I would definitely concur with that. So a lot of New York college lobbying is responsive to things that get issued by the governor's office. And so here's how they do it. There's a pretty well-established literature in political science looking at the various tactics that advocates use. And again, I grouped them into direct and indirect. That's nothing groundbreaking, but direct is good old-fashioned lobbying, meeting with the legislator, talking a bill that you care about. Indirect tactic is a little broader, mobilizing the public, grassroots campaigning, issue-oriented things. And so here's the breakdown of direct and indirect. So I heard a whole host of different mentions. Direct and indirect breaks down roughly evenly. Relationships are the big one. And I would kind of agree with that lobbying is a long-term process of building relationships, inviting elected officials to campus. All three sectors mentioned that. Using your associations, we heard Rebecca talk about this a little bit. All three, actually mostly public and privates leverage their associations, the privates especially. There are lots and lots of little colleges in New York State that don't necessarily have in-house government affairs staff. So they look at the Commission for Independent Colleges and Universities, CICU, to help them out. Interestingly, I also highlighted expertise as a pretty common way of advocating and heavily relied upon by the private colleges. Again, I mentioned the big colleges we have, sharing your expertise about climate, about racial justice, about anything that's in the news. The college professors are a great resource. And interesting, I was a little bit surprised to see on the alumni and grassroots tactic that it was solely used by public institutions. And that's where a SUNY college might say, look, we've got an alum in Senator so-and-so's district. Can we ask that alum to help us echo a message or echo something that we need help with? So another thing that kind of emerged in all these interviews was kind of a look into the process of lobbying. And I kind of developed a model, a 3-stage or 3-bucket model. And there's these 3 buckets of funding. One is very broad that all the colleges go for, and then it kind of filters down from there. And my dissertation, I called them buckets, but upon further reflection, I thought that red solo cups would be a more appropriate image to use when we're talking about colleges. So stage 1 is that big solo cup or a big bucket where all colleges lobby. Stage 2 is specific to for-profit, private, or public sectors. Stage 3 is every campus for themselves. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit on stage 1, where all the colleges, all the sectors get together. Here's a quote from a lobbyist who represent all different sectors. Says, the primary focus has always been financial aid. The priority has always been about how do we make sure students can enroll, have the opportunity to be successful, and complete a degree with the least amount of debt, which has really aligned us to be able to work with all sectors. So if you think about advocacy or lobbying for the student financial aid, for TAP, it's always been an area that all sectors have worked on collaboratively. They may have different viewpoints on it, or we may have different impacts, but we have, for the most part, always been aligned and working together from an advocacy perspective. So that's something I heard several times. Stage 2, zooming in. This is sector-specific funding. This lobbyist says there are a few issues that transcend public and private interests like TAP, some things we could all be in agreement on, and others we need to part company. Excelsior, the STEM scholarships are only for publics, and the privates we're trying to move in on those. So we're starting to see a little more competition. Okay, next quote is lobbies for a small private college. It said private, well, I set the quote up by saying private colleges banded together in early 2017 to oppose Governor Cuomo's Excelsior free tuition program for students at public colleges. And this person says that was a very intense time. We worked with CICU and they had a social media campaign. They're really especially trying to advocate against Excelsior. So a lot of it was trying to ensure the college was very much a part of that. So here we see a college is using 2 tactics, right? Social media and a advocacy association. Now the last stage is at the campus level. Big quote here from a lobbyist who says, in the SUNYs and CUNYs are independents. All of a sudden, when someone hires an individual lobbyist, then a sister organization is like, well, wait, they may get something and I may not, so I have to hire that person too. And there's a lot more competition. If you look at the SUNYs, especially the larger ones, say University of Buffalo, hires its own lobbyist. Stony Brook usually hires a lobbyist right behind it because they know there's only limited dollars and they both want something. And you could hire, you could see the same thing occurs in the independent sector, that if there's research money or something that's available, one institution may hire a lobbyist and then the institution will also hire a lobbyist because they want access to the same resource. So in terms of implications, you'll see that these interviews revealed some unique characteristics about what's going on in New York higher education. So there's a disproportionately powerful governorship, just the way that the state hierarchy and constitution is set up. then within that, you had a Governor Cuomo who was also disproportionately powerful, really leveraged everything at his disposal. We did learn that the sexual assault regulations that everyone had to scramble for during the 4th of July were actually in retaliation against the independent sector for pushing against Excelsior, which Excelsior, everyone I talked to said, kind of came out of the blue. The publics were fine with it. They didn't really have to do too much in addition to what the governor is already pushing, but the privates, some of them were going out of business. So another characteristic is about the for-profit sector. Now, we don't have University of Phoenix. We don't have these huge publicly traded for-profits in New York State. Most for-profits in New York are mom and pop, and they're pretty stable. And so that changes the dynamic. There isn't lots of political action PAC campaign contributions going on. Now, again, we have these major research universities on the private side. Most of them, I think all of them actually hire in-house lobbyists like me. So that kind of allows them to get more resources. And the city and state public systems, as I said, I was surprised to hear how they compete at the local level, right, for these smaller and smaller buckets of funding. There was an amazing quote from a community college lobbyist. I said, well, isn't there a formula approach that goes through the budget? Said, yeah, but we still have to fight over these almost, I won't say scraps, but smaller and smaller buckets of funding. So I just want to thank you, refer you to my dissertation, which has a federal perspective, a state perspective, and then an op-ed I wrote. I had it published inside of Higher Ed recently called Books or Bombs, and really a rallying call for colleges and universities to show up and lobby. There's this old lobbying expression called you're either at the table or on the menu. So it would be a shame, if colleges, are reticent to lobby, and then the military-industrial complex steps in and basically reallocates those dollars away from something that's actually good for civilization. So thank you so much for your time. Here's my contact information. Happy to talk more and entertain questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm sure we'll be touching on the collaboration or competition angle of that when we get to the Q&A. At least I will. Let's go to our third and final presentation, and we get 2 for the price of 1 here. We have Jack Manning, who is Commissioner of Beaver County, Pennsylvania, and Gene Chasin, who's the President and CEO of Community Catalyst Partners. We had to go out of state to find local governments that cooperate with local school districts. So we're pretty excited to see how Pennsylvania can school New York. Go ahead, Gene and Jack.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to share our screen. Okay. So we're excited to be with you this afternoon and to share the work that is taking place in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, where leadership from across all sectors of the community are coming together to define a future for the county and use that as a lever to make significant change in the way the various sectors work together and the way the various systems are structured in support of families and young people. As mentioned, I'm Gene Chasin. I lead a nonprofit organization called Community Catalyst Partners that works with cities, counties, and in some cases, large regional efforts to use economic development as a lever to improve educational opportunities for young people. With me is Jack Manning, County Commissioner in Beaver County. And I'm going to turn it over to Jack to talk a little bit about the conditions in Beaver County.
Yeah, first of all, it's an honor to be part of this program today. And by the way, Rebecca and Matt, I can relate to everything you said. As a former trustee of the local community college and now a county commissioner overseeing as a sponsor of the community college, there's a lot of stuff to relate to there. And as someone who had a very eclectic industry career and small business career and consulting career and ran a regional chamber of commerce, I'm familiar with lobbyists quite a bit from different things and lobbying. In order to understand where we are right now as we get into some of the details of the great work that community council has done. You have to look back at Beaver County just to give you a quick snapshot, if you will. But at one time, Beaver County was the most heavily industrialized county in the country. During World War II, particularly steel from Beaver County is everywhere from the Empire State Building to the Golden Gate Bridge. And our population peaked in the early to mid 70s. With the demise of the steel mills here, I have a newspaper quote. And by the way, I've only lived in the county about 22 years. So by county standards, I'm still a newbie. But I know enough to know that in January of 1983, there was a Post-Gazette article that the Pittsburgh metropolitan region total unemployment was 17.1%. In Beaver County, it was 27.1%. And that created a precipitous decline in our population from the mid to late 70s all the way into 2000, 2010. We kept losing population. Our school population declined from a peak of about 45,000 students to what you see here currently, about 21,000. So one thing that happened in Beaver County that kind of struck the start of a think tank on this is Shell Chemical announced that they were going to build a petrochemical site in Beaver County. It has been and is the largest site in North America. 8 to 10,000 construction workers coming into the area over the last 5 or 6 years, multi-billion-dollar project. And in 2016, a year after Shell announced this, a bunch of community leaders got together, 18 to 20 of us, created a think tank saying, how do we take this opportunity to get Beaver County growing again? What do we do? What are the steps we have to do? And we created several buckets for community development in terms of jobs and affordable housing and quality of life amenities. But one of the most important buckets that we looked at was quality, equitable educational opportunities. We still had 14 school districts, some of them very small, from those peaks in the 70s. We did have one voluntary merger, which, by the way, of the 501 school districts in Pennsylvania, is still the only voluntary merger that happened. So we thought some good things were happening, but then it stalled out. A lot of issues, a lot of concern, and clearly there wasn't equitable educational opportunities across the board for our students. Also coinciding with that, there was a study called The Inflection Point by something called the Allegheny Conference for Community and Economic Development, which is a 10-county Pittsburgh metropolitan region. They did a study and they looked at our aging demographic that was here in southwestern Pennsylvania, looked at the baby boomers that were retiring, looked at the modest growth that could occur, and we realized we were going to be 80,000 employees short of filling those jobs, just the retiring baby boomers, not to mention the significant growth opportunities were there. So we knew education and a K to 16 approach, if you will, to education was going to be fundamental to sustain growth and to increase growth. I also know, as someone that in my industry days relocated a couple of times, that the first thing a trailing spouse looks at when somebody comes home and says, hey, guess what? The family's moving to Virginia. The first thing you do is start to look at that area. Where am I going to send my kids to school? And it's vitally important. And we were competing with other newer school districts and other areas around the county, around southwestern PA that had newer schools, better schools versus the older aging schools. We also knew that of those 14 school districts, probably 10 of them were going to need significant renovations, $25 to $40 million worth of renovations. We're saying, is it worth it to put it into schools that may be graduating 50 kids a year? And we have a handful of those. So we knew something fundamentally had to be done, and we collected some data. We formed this Quality Education Council. And as a result of that, we ended up meeting Johns Hopkins University. So I'll kind of leave it there. I don't want to bore you with too much of the details, but if you're going to attract business, if you're going to grow, they need people. Supply of talent is the most important thing. And that's where the colleges that are located in Beaver County, the school districts, decided they needed to come together and reimagine what education could look like in the year 2030. And how do we start, how do we start to creep towards that? So Gene, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks, Jack. So Jack laid out the challenges Beaver County faced. I'm going to orient you a bit to our theory of action, and full disclosure, I'm a career educator. I was a principal, a superintendent. I taught at the University of Connecticut for 8 years and have run a couple of large national nonprofits. And candidly, the kind of work that Jack's talking about, whether it's retooling what education looks like, but also reconfiguring what it looks like to make it sized right, is long-term work. It's not work that's accomplished in 3-year chunks, it's work that's accomplished in 15-year chunks. And so a big piece of what we're doing in Beaver County is building understanding, commitment, and ownership. In a nutshell, what we're doing is tying all the work to the future of the county and bringing all sectors of the community together to understand that. In the case of Beaver County, it started, Jack alluded to this, it started with a study that was commissioned that we were involved with along with the Center for Research and Reform in Education at Johns Hopkins University. They looked at outcomes, they looked at spending, and we triangulated it with over 100 interviews with community leaders, with student focus groups, and with focus group sessions that took in about another 150 individuals from across the community. With that data, we brought that out to the community and had them make sense of the data that was generated. And when I say the community, it's not the usual people that are around the table. Rather, we worked with the local leaders to identify grassroots leaders, to identify the sectors that aren't typically at the table, that are necessary to support and understand what's taking place. So building that community context and that community understanding is a first step. We recently conducted town hall meetings with the data that came out of that report that included over 200 people directly participating in those town hall forums, and then an additional group of about 60 people making sense of what came out of those forums themselves. From there, we are identifying what we call a commitment incentive. Think of it as the last dollar scholarship. That's where this is settling. And that serves a couple of purposes. It delivers a simple message to young people and families that finances aren't a barrier to post-secondary opportunity. And when I say post-secondary, I mean both trade and vocational training, as well as traditional degree programs. So it communicates that simple message to the community. The other thing it does, though, is to raise the dollars for a scholarship program. It requires investment from people across the community, and that creates ownership and lasting ownership. From there, we're putting the systems and structures in place for this to be locally sustainable, putting together a data system and data dashboard that will inform the work, and formally bringing together that widespread leadership around a collaborative governance table so that they will own and operate this work going forward. Through that collaborative governance table, we'll be rolling out programming, academic and non-academic programming, again, utilizing the resources that exist across sectors. And what that drives is greater organizational coherence across the community, more effective utilization of resources, less expenditures for remedial programming and crisis services, and of course, improved outcomes for young people. We formed a planning committee in Beaver County about 4 months ago. I just described for you the town hall process, and out of that town hall process, we are establishing an overarching goal that addresses the economic future of the county as well as the quality of life. From there, the scholarship incentive is being established, the data dashboard is being put together, and then MOUs are being signed that include all sectors of the community, county government, city or town government, local education associations, employee unions, parent leadership, religious community leadership, all signing MOUs indicating what their roles and responsibilities are in this collaborative, and also the terms under which these scholarships will be able to roll out. From there, an executive director is going to be established. That executive director is a key facilitator and broker of the local effort. They're not employed by one of the traditional silos. Rather, their role is to serve as a neutral facilitator for the community. Once that person is on board, we're going to commence both pathway analytics and fiscal analytics. The pathway analytics look at the research-based milestones that a young person walks through to be post-secondary ready. So it starts with kindergarten readiness, which takes in that space from birth to school age, and ascends all the way up through reading at or above grade level, third grade, having the right kind of courses and the right skills and competencies in high school to be post-secondary ready, and then on up through matriculation and post-secondary completion. What we're looking for are the pinch points. Where are we losing young people along that pathway? Those pinch points will serve as focus areas for task forces that'll do root cause analysis and will drive the provision of services across the county. In addition to those pathway analytics, we also do fiscal analytics, where we look at every dollar spent in the education sector over the last 5 years, but then we also map it to expenditures in county services for youth and family services, what's being spent in town government, looking for where there's redundancy, where there's opportunities for braiding funding, and also where there are dollars available that communities are not drawing down. And typically those are federal dollars. We will be mapping all of the services that exist across the county, populating the governance structure, and then implementing a plan to roll out the services. So my organization has done this now in 4 different cities and in a couple of county instances and a large regional instance. We've used external research partners to look at outcomes, including the Maxwell School at Syracuse University, but also the Center for Research and Reform in Education at Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins developed a meta-analysis that speaks to these outcomes on the overhead. Most significant are significant increases in high school graduation rates, post-secondary matriculation rates, persistence rates, increased school enrollment. Jack spoke about declines in enrollment in literally every citywide instance that we've implemented this in. Communities have reversed 10-year trends of declining enrollment as they've rolled out this approach. The need for remedial services is an area that gets little attention, but it's significant. In the first citywide instance we rolled this out in, within the first 5 years, they had a 43% reduction in the number of young people going into the foster care system. And that's because of the impact of those academic and non-academic supports, wraparound supports, to address family need before they reach crisis points. Increased achievement in the school districts has been documented literally across the board. And in many cases, increased population and increased poverty values have also been identified in the research done in the communities we've worked with. Jack, if you want to speak to what's currently taking place in Beaver County.
Yeah, there is tremendous coming together of all these sectors. I mean, there's a lot of obstacles you have to overcome when you're talking about locally elected school boards, 14 school boards, their own special interests, everything from race to poverty to school debt, and the thought that this is all about mergers. And this isn't all about mergers. It is about bigger is better. It's about how do we attain equitable educational opportunities for every student in Beaver County to be prepared for life and pursue the career path that's right for them and right for their families. That's all it's about. And we don't know what all the solutions are, but we have this great mix, cross-sector support from all of the school districts, the community, the business community, the nonprofit communities. Jean recounted the religious community, faith-based groups, and we have a planning education committee now that really is at the heart of what we're doing. 35 to 40 representatives from across the county. We had the community input that Jean talked about that we know is vital. I mean, one of the things we learned in the study and the data is that 74% of the households in Beaver County don't have any school-age children going to any school, but they're paying the taxes to support those schools. So how do you engage the community and get them to buy in, and just not the people that have a vested interest because their kids are attending school right now? So it has to be a countywide input in those forums. The community goals, as Jean said, are being developed. One of the outcomes of this group early on was we do have 3 colleges that reside in Beaver County. One is a Penn State University extension, Penn State Beaver. We have the Community College of Beaver County that I mentioned, and we have a private Division III religious college in Geneva. The 3 of them have come together. If you had told me 20 years ago that a public university, Penn State, a community college, and a private Christian school would come together to look at how they can be part of the solution of this, I wouldn't have believed you. But they're on board as well because they know their future depends on a strong educational system that's sustainable and continuing to bring people forward. So they're all part of these subcommittees, communication and marketing. There is, as Jean alluded to, search for an executive director to kind of run this, and those memorandums are in place. And it's just good to see the receptivity of this issue. There's still a lot of hurdles to overcome, but we're well on our way, I believe, to a tipping point to turning the opportunities around so that your child's education isn't dependent on the zip code that you're born in. And that's what we're trying to get to. So.
Thanks, Jack. The one additional piece, the minority participation has expanded dramatically in Beaver County. It's been really critical and important. Jack, do you want to speak a little to that before I go to the last slide?
Yeah, so I mean, we reached out. We knew, in Beaver County, the minority population is concentrated into primarily a couple of third-class cities that are at opposite ends of the county. One of those, the city of Aliquippa. If you know anything about football in Western Pennsylvania, you know the name Aliquippa High School. It is predominantly Black. It graduates 60 kids a year. They win state championships year after year. Darrell Rivas came from Aliquippa. Mike Ditka came from Aliquippa. Joe Namath came from Beaver Falls, the one that's at the other end there. So high minority populations. We knew we had to get those folks engaged, and particularly the minority population, churches and the like, and the school leaders of those communities, because that is the issue of race is a significant issue when you're sorting out these kinds of activities and where your kids can go to school.
Thanks, Jack. So in closing, truly what we're doing is building widespread community understanding that their economic future and the future of the county is dependent on strengthening the education sector, so that we can make the kind of structural and instructional changes that are necessary. The other thing I'd mentioned, I talked about the other communities we've done this in. One of the things that we're most excited about is all of those communities, going back to efforts that were launched 15 years ago, are still completely on track. Those partners are still at the table, meeting on a regular basis. And that building that kind of grassroots ownership and building that incentive device we view as critical. And that's part of what differentiates this approach from other collective impact approaches. Our contact information is here. We would be happy to answer any questions. We look forward to any questions that may have come up in the chat, and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Gene and Jack. Very interesting. As a certified cynical New York resident and a one-time local government office holder, all this collaboration and cooperation just blowing my mind. And as I was taking notes, I was realizing that for each of the three of you, they were almost always about this whole competition versus collaboration component. And I do want to just touch on that, and maybe we'll go on the order that you presented. So Rebecca, I understand from your typology that the local governments do have influence. Do they play well with others in their sandbox? Do they join with the states, or do they look to go around the states?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. That's a really great question. One of my areas for future research agenda, in fact, wanted to ask that question. For example, at the community college level, how much influence does the local government have vis-a-vis the state government? Because both of those government entities are providing a lot of resources. They're very important. They have a hand in the day-to-day regulation and governance of the institutions. But which one is having more influence, or is it more complicated than that? So for example, maybe community colleges, maybe the local government is having more influence in one area and the state in another area. To answer your question, even though I haven't studied that particular question, the very nature of local government power is that it's a delegation from the state. So my educated guess at the answer to your question would be that the state will hold more of the power, because if there's ever a disagreement that the state feels strongly about, it's the state's power and it's the state's authority at the end of the day. But I do think it would be really interesting, the issue of cooperating and coming to some sort of an agreement or a settlement where there is a disagreement, I think is a more effective way for the different levels of government to go about operating community colleges and other aspects of higher education.
Thank you. And Matthew, in this advocacy, I mean, every time I wrote down a note, you sort of addressed it in your survey comments. And I was going to ask, do the public universities, do they actively band together? And then you started talking about the independent hiring of lobbyists. Are they quick to throw each other under the bus? Or is it really just an opportunistic based on what they're asking for at a given time?
Yeah, I think it's a both and thing, where they get together at the top level to make sure their priorities are heard. And then there's definitely no throwing under the bus. It's if anything, a friendly competition. From an observational point of view, it is a little bit tragic, to even have to do that. I talk to friends in Germany or Japan and say, what do you do for a living? And I say, well, I advocate for funding for higher education. So why? Why is that even a job in America? And so, yeah, the way our system is set up is a necessary evil for the publics in particular to have to do that. But in an ideal world, there would be a formula, and then that's the formula. But yeah, I think I would put a little bit of blame on the for-profit sector for inserting itself in New York and elsewhere to steer public resources away from the existing nonprofits. That said, in New York, the previous governor came down pretty hard on for-profits, and it's harder for them to do that. So yeah.
You did note that there is a difference in sector too, and have been some battles in the sector, particularly on Excelsior Scholarship, where the publics were all for it, and the privates were saying just increase TAP and let people make their own decisions. Do those have, in any of your discussions, do those type of disagreements do they leave lasting wounds, or do they just move on to the next funding issue in the next cycle?
Right. Yeah. Another, kind of lobbyist expression is to live to fight another day. So, and it's all about relationship building among lobbyists too. There's a lot of cycling. It's a kind of a niche industry, so you wouldn't want to burn bridges. I think we were all, even the publics who saw the Excelsior thing come down, were surprised. A lot of policies, even at the federal level too, are what I call in my dissertation unexpected windfall. And actually, I think that's quoting somebody else from a long time ago. But there's these unexpected windfalls that government will do, and I don't know if part of me thinks maybe they aren't so unexpected if there's consistent lobbying presence in Albany. Is the timing of and the announcement by a governor, is it totally out of nowhere, or is it the result of years of relationships? So I think that's the researcher's challenge, to kind of, I don't like isolation or reductionism as a practice, but I think that that we have to start there, and then see what the independent variables that one thing led to another, cause and effect, is ultimately the hardest thing to find out, especially in lobbying and politics.
Thank you. Let me try to squeeze one more in here. And Jack, from your perspective, there's a tremendous amount of groundwork done at the grassroots level for getting buy-in. And I just kept writing buy-in with a big question mark, and how to achieve that. Is there anything in particular? These are particularly passionate and emotional issues. Is there, a key component that without it, this whole thing would unravel, or is it really, do you really need every single component of it?
You really need every single component. We have, Pennsylvania being a commonwealth, the county, while people look to us to lead, and I've been I'm very passionate about this, passionate about education. We are also the least consequential of the municipal governments, because the 53 municipalities that make up Beaver County have all the control in terms of local ordinances, planning, zoning, those kinds of things. You have 14 independently elected school boards that are there. You have Harrisburg telling us how things are going to be funded, or Washington, D.C. And here we are in the county trying to sort all this out. But we're the one that everybody points to, solve it, solve it, solve it. So I do think we were critical to that, but we needed to have the buy-in from the school districts, the superintendents primarily, and they were our first line of attack. They know what they're facing. They know they're on, some of them are on unsustainable path. They know the inequitable funding that comes in and the need for higher state subsidies because of poverty levels in some of their districts. And the rich districts keep getting richer and the poor districts keep getting poorer and the populations keep declining. Then you add on the charter schools and the cyber schools that have come, that are starting to drain money away. And it's a very tenuous situation. So it was really getting the public schools, the charter schools, the superintendents of those folks to understand what we were trying to do first, then spread to the school boards, and then bring the community in, kind of in those layers of the onion, if you will. I don't know, Gene, anything?
No, I think you covered it, Jack. That's great.
Well, thank you all. I think we're at time. Rebecca, Matthew, Jack, and Jean, I thought this was fabulous. Really emphasized the growing role of local government influence, impact, and need on various education systems. Appreciate all of your research, and thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great session.